Thanks so much for joining us today for our Artists in Conversation Live, our first Facebook Live experience here at the Welland Museum. I'm Tracy Adler, the Johnson-Pote Director of the Welland Museum of Art at Hamilton College, in conversation with artist Julia Jacquette. Her exhibition is currently on view at the Welland through July 2nd. We will be taking questions via Facebook and Twitter. Our hashtag is Welland Live, so please feel free to send in questions related to the dialogue that we're having here. We're rounding up a pretty exciting week here at the Welland. Julia has had the opportunity to engage with numerous classes on many subjects, providing new insights into her work. It's been really exciting and fun. And we've also had public discussions and private discussions where we've really delved into a lot of the meaning and imagery of your work. And here we are sitting in front of one of two murals created specifically for the show. This exhibition is the largest survey of Julia's work and features many works from the last 10 years, paintings, works on paper, including original drawings from the graphic memoir, Playground of My Mind, which was also produced as a publication, and ceramic works as well. So thanks for being here with us today, Julia. Why don't we talk a little bit, let's start at the beginning. Let's talk a little bit about the imagery that you draw from, which is so provocative and is such an important part of understanding your work.
Certainly. So the imagery that I'm using in my work is all quotes from media imagery, advertisements, catalog imagery, mostly things from print, but also nowadays I'm getting imagery online. And we're sitting in front of one of the murals, which was created with the more than assistance, the incredible hard work of 6 Hamilton students. And this mural is a quote of an image of a swimming pool from a catalog cover, clothing catalog cover. And in the original image, a beautiful fashion model in a bikini is on an inner tube and is floating around a crystal clear, sparkling in the sun swimming pool. So, but I have decided to focus on the water. And as I was discussing with one of the Hamilton students who came to look at the show and hear me talk about it, as I discussed with them and her, my gaze is slightly askew. It's slightly away from the protagonist of this scene. And that is because truly I am so overwhelmed and stunned by the beauty of this scene, and also made to feel so insignificant by it and envious of it, that my gaze wanders away and stays on in this almost like dazzled, shaky way on the water and the reflection of the water. But our protagonist is still here.
Yes, we can see a little bit of her leg there.
Exactly.
But very little.
Very little. And that's also to talk about how the specter, the presence of the beautiful fashion model is one that's so alluring and also so soul-crushing for many of us.
Yeah, we see her more in the disruption of the water than in the figure itself.
Exactly.
And in many of your images that draw from advertising, both these glossy magazines as well as these flashy images that come up on our screens advertising various products, it's interesting that we're focusing on the aura of the scene and on the ancillary kind of art direction of the scene. You've often called the art directors the evil geniuses behind the camera who are kind of manipulating it so that it's all these things are calculated to be so alluring. Yeah. And obviously that is,
and they work.
That works.
They work.
But you're critical of it too. So.
Yeah, because that presence in our life, or that narrative in our life, which has probably been in humankind since language started or even before, this presence of a narrative of a perfect life, a perfect, glamorous, happy life where there is no chaos, where everything's under your control, where you have this collection of possessions that are just the right ones. I could go on and on. This narrative of this myth is incredibly anxiety-producing in all of us. And again, maybe it's part of being a human being, but I want to talk about it. I've got to talk about it because it is so much part of how my mind works. So I am very blessed to be an artist and to be able to discuss this by making artwork about it. And there's a quote from Andy Warhol that has followed me throughout my life as an artist, which, I may be paraphrasing slightly, but I believe Andy said, if I've got a problem, I make artwork about it, and then I no longer have a problem. And maybe for me, it's like, well, I never really rid myself of these feelings, but it's an opportunity for me to have a conversation with other people about it, with my viewers. And I mean, me, for example, because of my artwork, I'm here and I'm having this great conversation with the students that have come to the show.
Well, talking about Andy Warhol, you've often described yourself as a pop artist via feminism. And we're talking about a lot of these alluring images and how they kind of manipulate us and really affect our feelings of self-worth and how we view ourselves and how we position ourselves in the world, particularly as women. So if you could talk a little bit about the pop influences and how your work differs from that, and also talk about feminism and its impact on your work.
Absolutely. So growing up in the 70s, certainly the pop artists were very present in the culture and in New York City, and I responded to all of that as a kid. I can't remember never not knowing who Andy Warhol was. That sounds pretentious, but I don't mean it, right? He was so much...
Well, he was on the Love Boat. I mean, he was everywhere.
He was everywhere. And actually, if you were a New Yorker, it was more than...
We saw him.
We saw him walking around the streets. I never met him, but I would see him in Tower Records. And so... But there were other pop artists that had a big influence, like the recently late James Rosenquist, whose style was that of sign painting, and I love that both very abstract and very realistic style. And I also love the imagery that he put into his work. Especially, for example, the painting F-111, which permanently lives in the Museum of Modern Art.
I know you love the spaghetti part of it.
I love the spaghetti in that. And the little girl and all. But yeah, the food imagery, I think I've been responding to since I was a kid. And also there were painters who weren't considered pop artists, but who were getting attention in the 70s. Audrey Flack, who was making big paintings of the top of her dresser or a dresser with all the sparkly bottles and cosmetics. There was and is Janet Fish, who was making paintings in the 70s of household objects like bottles of Heinz vinegar and all the reflection in them. So those were some of the works that I was looking at that time. But I also, at that time, had a mom who was talking about ideas of feminism, even if she didn't necessarily say that word. She talked about, most notably, or what I can remember most clearly, is how women and men were depicted in the media, especially how women were depicted. And she was just totally irritated by how women were objectified on television in the 60s and 70s. And bless her heart for doing that, because it shaped how I think. As kids, we were a little annoyed because we'd be trying to watch I Dream of Jeannie or Star Trek, and my mom would be saying, oh, look at the mini skirts on those women. And it's not that she didn't also wear short skirts at the time, but here they were supposed to be astronauts and they were in micro minis. And she, pointed that out strong and clear. And that has stayed with me to this day. It's how I look at the world and how I look at media images. It's mostly a blessing, sometimes a curse, because even one's favorite films, and you and I have been talking about that, are beloved films.
Yeah.
They'll be unbelievably objectifying portrayal, a character, how woman characters portrayed, and it's so hard to reconcile that for oneself. So.
Well, it was interesting yesterday because we had a discussion with Abigail Child, the filmmaker,
yes.
in conjunction with FILM series here, and she is really taking back the gaze in a lot of her work. There is a highly charged, some violence, some sexual imagery, but it's really it doesn't feel like it's like the women are. She's really taking that back. And one of the things that's come up this week is also how you are reclaiming the gaze. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that in the work.
And that was a beautiful statement made by one of the students who came here. I've learned so much just by talking to them and hearing their perspectives on the work. So yes, so Abigail Child, her work, especially from the late 80s, has been a big influence, where she's quoting found footage, but also creating her own footage that apes old film, and she's nabbing the gaze and making it a female gaze, and with a lot of humor. That's important. And so, yes, in my work, I'm trying to reclaim the gaze, which usually in any society is mostly a male gaze. I mean, that's changing somewhat, but still that's the dominant gaze. And I'm also really admitting a lot of weakness in that. So I'm saying, yes, I'm reclaiming the gaze, and I'm also telling you of how, again, dazzled, shell-shocked, jittery, overwhelmed I am when I even have it. There's so much that's so powerful. So I'm trying to make the viewer see through my gaze, but it's sort of one that admits its own, shakiness and insecurity.
And there's a lot of images of women. We have actress Gold Dress, which is drawn from probably the most recognizable image in the show, I would say, from the Charlize Theron ad campaign of J'adore Dior. And it's just her décolletage in this shimmery dress. And then we also have the mouths of the four Gorgons, which shows these beautifully made up, this suite of four beautifully made up, glistening lips, mouths parted. And so, talk a little bit about how the representation of women is a significant part of your work and has always been a significant part of your work.
So that, and again, I'm going to credit Mom for a lot of this, right? Her pointing this out has had a huge influence on the work. And But one thing we've mentioned is that in the paintings, I'm never including, it's never a portrait of any of these women. It's a discussion about how they're portrayed, and the view is usually right alongside them, focusing on their accoutrement. And in the J'adore Dior ad, it's that incredible, reflective and sparkling dress. And in other paintings, we see maybe just a model's hand, and how probably her hand has been airbrushed so there are no veins or wrinkles. And there are also ads where we do see a little bit of a esteemed male who's very gorgeous, Matthew McConaughey.
In your hotel room series.
Yes, also a perfume ad, right? So perfume ads are masterful at showing these mythical interiors and all their glamorous sexiness. And we see just a little of him.
Just an ear or a sleeve,
an ear
right?
or a sleeve, because we're also looking at the hotel room, the classic hotel room that somebody has decided is a perfect place to shoot this, and then also probably has added to it. So it's out of a movie of with the most ideal setting for this.
We also have a question.
We have a question from Facebook for you, Julia. What do you think is the best way to educate children on the unrealistic quality of some advertisements?
Wow, what a fantastic question. How to educate children on how advertisements, the imagery in advertisements. And I would say by simply talking about it with them, asking them questions about it. It's what I try to do with my adult students, is a discussion shouldn't be, or it shouldn't be just my own pontification, it should be a discussion about something. So yeah, I would say kids should be asked, well, what do you think of this? Do you think that's a real person? And what do you think they're doing, and why here? And just questions and talk.
And also sort of informing them, like, this is not truth.
Yes.
So that comes up again and again in the work. You have these sumptuous images of alcohol, of, white wine and rum and scotch on the rocks, and they are so sumptuous. They're over the top. So they kind of present this idea, this glamorized idea of the consumption of alcohol, which is already problematic, which is so far from the reality of what it would look like if we sat here and poured ourselves a drink. So if you could talk a little bit about that too, and just the effects of that, I think, are so significant.
Well, those works of art came from exactly what you're talking about, and one motivation being trying to talk about the beauty, the ironic beauty of alcohol advertising, and the incredibly high-resolution photography that's taken to show these close-ups of glasses. But also I've kind of been fascinated for a while at how our culture and our society is so centered around alcohol. Our gatherings are so centered on alcohol. And it's not that I'm saying it's a universal evil, and certainly I tremendously enjoy my glass of wine with dinner, and but I also have seen how strangely uncreative we are with how to interact with one another, and there isn't really, as far as the center of our culture, another way it seems that people know how to be together. And it's then, in a funny, formal way, also been this color discovery of a palette that I hadn't thought about before. A beautiful, tawny, butterscotch kind of palette in these
Yeah,
advertisements.
you said you're more drawn towards jewel tones, but
Yes.
this has a kind of different type of richness.
Yeah.
You know, and you've also talked about it as being a kind of masculine type of palette too.
Yeah, if I'm standing in front of my palette and I'm just improvising, which I've learned I shouldn't do because I always come up with the same answer, which is a few favorite jewel tones, very vivid colors, usually the same categories. And when I gave myself the project of, okay, let's look at these close-ups of glasses of scotch on the rocks, or bourbon, or white wine, suddenly there's this whole family of colors that is very beautiful and very harmonized, but is a very different family. Yellow ochres, kind of olivey greens, really desaturated, and a lot of variety, and emitting or I think depicting a lot of warmth. So that has been this exploration of color. But color, one of the thoughts here is, does color bring content with it, even if you don't know what the image is? I'm not entirely sure, but I sure know that I like thinking about that.
So we have the two paintings, Wine White and Colors from Wine White, shown side by side. And can you talk a little bit about those works?
Yeah, so white wine is an image of a super close-up looking down into a glass of white wine with all its reflection and color and sparkle. And Colors, white wine, has it is the same image, but I have abstracted it even further. I've geometricized it even more, and it's basically a fun game for myself. Making that painting was this, making this system and really enjoying. I'm going to insert these same colors into this field of concentric circles, and hey, does it still read as white wine? I don't know, but it's certainly to play with that. And I feel like in many ways, the whole show is a color chart.
Yeah.
A lot of different color charts, thinking about what colors are on things that you never thought about. Like there's another painting of liquor that's a cocktail made with Campari and cognac and probably some kind of sparkling beverage. And that is one of the most, to me, when I saw this photograph in a magazine, like a seascape almost of turbulence and bubbles and sparkle and all this orangey red color.
It's so abstracted in a way.
So abstracted, and it's one of the larger pieces in the show. And I want the viewer just to feel like I want to go in there. I want to be immersed in there. And maybe they wouldn't know, probably not, what the liquid actually was, if not for the title.
And yes, and you know, we have the discussion about representation and abstraction and this tension between the two. You know, when we stand back from these murals, they seem very cohesive visually, even though they are reflections of things in the water. But the closer you get, the imagery just disintegrates, and I know that's a big part of your work.
I love that. I love the tension between abstraction and representation, and my favorite pieces are, my favorite paintings always have that tension. And I think of course, Vermeer, the Dutch Golden Age painter, who so many of us love the work of, and he saw, I think, his subject matter very clearly in abstract shape, and he kept things pared down and simplified, yet the paintings are incredibly complex as far as composition goes, or I should say super interesting. And he also knew how, on another topic, how to keep things soft. And that really does mimic our sight, right? We really don't see everything in sharp focus. So we have this feeling of air when you when you paint things out of focus, and this soft focus.
And you see, you're seeing the world through lenses too, because obviously this is all taken from photography that's, highly manipulated. And obviously, it's commonly believed that Vermeer used camera obscura or lenses as well to create that. And I know that that's a deliberate connection between your work.
Absolutely. So all of this work here, all of these paintings wouldn't have been possible and are really talking about photography to some extent. This is a visual language of photography, and I absolutely acknowledge how, in a way, full of pathos the act of painting these images is, right? I'm trying to capture in paint these photographic images as a way of owning them. And it's a complicated endeavor in that you have to work wet into wet to keep everything soft in soft focus. And that's a very, there's a big question, why do that? Why not just re-photograph these photographs? And that certainly has been a strategy by other artists, but in my case, and not an incorrect one in their cases, but in my case, it's almost performative for me, this idea that I am in the studio faithfully trying to capture these images as a way to own them almost, and to have them.
And the scale too. I mean, the scale is very large. It's very exaggerated. You're taking something from a glossy magazine. You're focusing on this one little area, and you're always blowing it up. And even though there's various scales of work in the show, your approach is generally monumental.
Yeah.
And that certainly comes through in the murals.
Yes.
And so, talk a little bit about like your experience working for muralists, and then, this being the first experience you've had of actually creating your own imagery in the mural medium.
Yes. So here's the great job for a young artist being on the crew of mural painters that assisted, and studio assistants that assisted the artist Richard Haas, who is known for many things, but especially for his trompe-l'oeil murals throughout the US, and there's also one in Munich. And this was fantastic training, and I learned the procedure, the very analog procedure of making an initial small painting, making a maquette, scaling it up, how to work on a crew, how important it was to have pre-mixed colors, and that also brings me to mention the wonderful involvement of the Goldens at Golden Paint, and who are fortunately not too far away from
We're so
the
lucky.
Welland. We're really lucky to have them 45 minutes away, and they were and are very anxious to collaborate with the Welland.
They were great collaborators on this project.
And how that worked is I made swatches with the same material that I made my maquettes with, which is gouache, and sent these swatches to their brilliant paint technician, Julia Jacquette, and he then made jars of paint that perfectly matched my gouache colors. So then after we had drawn in full scale the murals, me and my assistants could take off running. We could then work as a team and insert all the colors by number, yes, the system of a paint by numbers painting, onto the walls. And I'm lucky that the Hamilton students really embraced that system and went with it, and it was my first time making my own imagery into a mural. Now, that being said, those techniques that I learned as a young mural painter for Richard were very, very helpful when I was making large works on canvas for a number of reasons. One, it takes the fear out of working large. When you've been on a crew that's been working on the side of a building, a 6-foot high painting does not seem that intimidating. But also it gave me the procedures of good ways of blowing up imagery and doing that mostly without projectors. So sometimes I use one, but actually I'm really comfortable with very old school gridding up, or the idea of an intermediate drawing, or press through methods, or what we used on these murals to transfer the drawing was good old-fashioned pouncing, where we put needle pricks in the drawing. When we taped it up on the wall, we rubbed blue powdered chalk through those holes. So we got our outline drawing transferred that way, probably an ancient.
A cartoon, you know, to transfer the original drawing. So you talked a little bit about your attraction to jewel tones, and we really see that a lot in the food paintings. Those all combine image and text, which is another theme. And one thing that I find that's interesting about your work is that you don't complete one series and the next series. The series themselves are very fluid and open-ended, and that's how it's put together in the show to kind of reflect the way that you approach it, interspersing different works from different series. But maybe you could talk a little bit about the food and the image and text relationship, how that all came about.
Sure. So I've been including food images in my work on and off for, 20 more years, and I felt compelled to use food initially as this sort of visual metaphor for the desired thing, whether that be a person or romance itself or just desire. So I recently felt compelled to use food again and use text again in my work. I initially used text to push that analogy or visual metaphor of imagery being stand-in, and stand-in for desire or the desired object. And now I'm using it also to talk about longing, but it's sort of expanded, that longing, or morphed a bit into, really longing for that perfect life that I know very well doesn't exist. And the text that I felt compelled to use most recently has to do with my own self-doubt. And hoping that by making work about that self-doubt, I would exercise it, a word that you would, I think, is a good one. So one of the paintings here that uses text, which actually isn't of food, it's of couches, has been especially fascinating to a lot of the young people who have seen my work. Initially, that painting was in a faculty show at Fashion Institute of Technology where I teach, and of course now it's here. And so a lot of students got to see that, art students got to see that painting, and a lot of questions about it. So I sort of knew that was still a very viable strategy. I knew it myself, but it made it especially interesting and satisfying when a lot of my 20-year-olds were super intrigued and wanted to know more about
And
it.
especially because that imagery in the couch painting and some of the food paintings too, as well as some of the images of women, are drawn from not contemporary images, but advertisements and cookbooks and other types of publications from the 1950s, 60s, 70s as well.
Yeah. Well, I sort of feel like we're still living in the 50s in some ways. It's just the mythology that was present in the 50s just has never left us. It's in a different form, maybe, but I feel like we keep going back to it. And so that's part of the reason, but also because of this, out of a desire for art directors or film directors, I don't even know exactly what, wanting to create a language that was maybe universal, we get really iconic imagery from that time. And that imagery hasn't lost its power, but it's also a kind of essentialism, the idea, what women are, or even what food is, what men are like is so distilled into this one idea, and that fascinates me and it drives me crazy.
Is the food are they stand-ins for something else, or?
They previously they were for a beloved, let's say, and now it's more about, and I was talking with Hamilton students about this, we often see images of food in multiple, right? In a cookbook, in a magazine. Pasta with this sauce, pasta with that sauce, or try this sauce, or cakes, we see, or desserts a lot, even on the shelves, right? All the different cake mixes. So when I wanted to include this listing of text in the work, it was a wonderful accompaniment, right? This one or this one. This idea also that it could be endless. Really, I could go on forever, just like in current day supermarkets. Just in the cake mix aisle, it's an unlimited number of choices that you have. So, and actually, the supermarket is a good idea, organizational idea, and one that I'm now realizing I always have in my head, right? It's this giant hanger full of this soup, this soup, this soup, and that, and of course there's Andy Warhol.
Well, and then there's the one painting in the supermarket circular. So there's a wide range. I mean, you have like these very luxury magazines down to this very modest advertisement, which you get when you walk in the door of a supermarket. But instead of it saying, sirloin $2.99 a pound, it has these statements that profess your own self-doubt.
Yes, and that
comfort in a familiar strategy.
And that painting really does talk about strategy and thinking about, am I doing the same thing? And oh my goodness, I am. And I want nostalgia and I want comfort. And, I would even say that those supermarket circulars are pretty idealized and beautiful, like the food, the kind of, they probably get their photos from some stock photography place, but some food stylist has made them perfect. And I am completely engrossed by that, what the food stylist decides to, little sprig of parsley or little cherry tomato to accompany the image.
So talking about image and text, I want to make sure we have time to really discuss Playground of My Mind, which was a graphic memoir that had been on your mind for many years, for a decade, and then you actually created the gouache drawings for them over the last 6 years, and we were able to publish it in this book, and it traces your childhood both through image and text. in growing up in New York City, and specifically focuses on the adventure playgrounds that were designed in the 60s and 70s in Central Park that had this really kind of unique approach to play. And you draw a direct line between this kind of creative play, abstracted play, risk-taking play, and your own creativity as an artist. So maybe you can delve into that.
Well, I had been thinking about a playground that had been in the private courtyard of the New York City building that I grew up in, Columbus Park Towers. There was a playground that was really also considered to be a sculpture by its architect, M. Paul Freeburg, but I didn't know his name as a kid. And it was a great gift to us kids. I mean, not literally gift, but a great gift of design to us because it was right in our building and it was incredibly safe to play there. And the playground had a very strong sense of organization, theme and variations, geometry, but variation within that vocabulary of being enclosed and yet us kids being able to enter it. When I say closed and open at the same time, walls somewhere, but in those walls always a portal that you could go through. So I decided at one point I wanted to make some kind of artwork about it, and it had been taken down, destroyed in the late 90s, and I searched for photos, didn't find many, but decided I wanted to make this project anyway. It took me a while to realize that the form it should take should be a graphic memoir. And I realized, well, how perfect the fact that my father also had designed a playground with two partners that's in Central Park to this day. And I thought more about the playgrounds that influenced me, and that included a really seminal one by Richard Datner called The Adventure Playground. And then I also realized that I was seeing a lot of similar visual language in playgrounds in Amsterdam. Like, does one's childhood environment influence you? And I know for me, the answer is yes. So one of the other points that I posit is that these playgrounds, these architect design playgrounds, you could even call them brutalist playgrounds, because they are the language of that kind of architect, deconstructed. They all had a feeling of inner structure that even as a kid I could feel and understand, or to use a 70s term, that I could grok. And I took that feeling of, or that understanding of, or that idea of deep structure into my own work, which looks very different. But in my painting, but I'm also using this idea of a modular system that together, and using that system together, I'm using various images that together make up a whole.
And you've also talked about how just the process of working as an artist, you talk about it as deep play, too.
And I love that term, and I learned that at the undergraduate college that we went to, both at different times, at Skidmore in my basic psychology course, and I believe that comes from the child psychologist, or the expert on child psychology, Piaget, and it's that state that kids get into, and another way of saying it is they're in the zone. And so when I am in deep play, I forget about everything else and really get to the meat of the matter in the work, no pun intended. And I have to say, I crave that state. And I think we all do, actually.
Yeah.
I think we all love being very engrossed in something and losing sense of time and where we are, even some of
Grown-up play.
Grown-up play, whether that be writing or cooking or just some kind of creative activity. It's really wonderful.
So we're going to now take some questions from Facebook and Twitter.
Fantastic.
Here we have a question from Twitter for Julia. Your graphic memoir is a familiar format to many people. What graphic novels inspired you during the work's creation?
So what graphic novels inspired you during the work's creation? They're not just novels, too, right?
Yeah. So there's so many wonderful ones in existence right now. So a big influence and somebody I admire so much is the graphic novelist David Mazzucchelli, who I'm happy to say I know. We both had the same drawing and painting professor, not at the same time, but that's how we met. And all David's work has been influential. The magazine that he self-published for a short while in the late 80s or early 90s, Rubber Blanket was a big influence even on the size of Playground in My Mind. And his book as graphic novel Asterius Polyp, which is coincidentally about an architect, but his is fiction, I think is one of the most engrossing and beautiful graphic works of art ever. Then, of course, the celebrated Alison Bechdel, Fun Home, is a book that's huge for me, and really admiring of it, and how she talked about her family life. And although I had started Playground in My Mind already, I believe, when that came out, it was a confirmation or buoyed me up in feeling like, okay, it's to write about oneself in a graphic form is valid. And then also her book that came out more recently, Are You My Mother, was one that I went out and got right away. So her work, super important. And somebody who I've looked at for years and who used to have work in the Village Voice, I believe, Linda Barry. I'd sort of have been forgetting to mention her, but her humor and of course I have a very different drawing style than she does, but I admire her so much, and she's been going strong. I mean, her recent work, there's one about teaching, and that is fantastic. So those are some of the graphic novelists and graphic memoirists. But I do have to say they're books that I had as a kid, incredibly important. The books of David Macaulay, like Cathedral and Pyramid, of course, were big for me.
Okay, another question from Facebook. Do you think that the current political climate in the U.S. will change your work in any way, or the subjects you choose to use?
So how are you impacted how does the current events of the day impact your work?
I have been wondering this too, and I have a hunch that it will. In that, I think it will, the current political climate will make me want to talk about feminism even more.
Right.
And how can I do that in a way that is not didactic and full of humor and visual interest? Because I don't want to repeat the didactic quality of a lot of the current narrative in the air. I want to do that with subtlety and intelligence, and I don't know what it's going to be yet, but it's on my mind. Definitely, definitely.
Okay, another question for Julia. Did you listen to music by the women featured in Hand's Women Rock Musicians series while creating those pieces? Or do you have a go-to soundtrack in making art?
Well, I think that brings up two interesting points. So they're asking about, there's a series of ceramic tiles of the hands of women rock musicians as you enter the exhibition space. And what's so interesting about them is it's very unlike the rest of the work. It's purely an homage.
Yes.
These are not photoshopped or highly stylized images. In
That's
fact,
right.
sometimes it's hard to tell that they're even
Yeah.
women. So the person is asking about the soundtrack. Do you listen to these musicians? But also, what do you listen to as you're working in the studio?
So yes, absolutely. I listen to the music of all these women rock musicians. They're all people that whose music I love, and I love watching them as performers.
So it's Patti Smith.
Patti Smith, P.J. Harvey, Michelle Ndegeocello, Fiona Apple, Kelly Deal, Kim Deal, more, and I think the series will go on. And I also listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm in the studio. That's a wonderful thing. I'm a big fan of radio, and just the digital world has expanded radio right now, which actually I think is a fantastic thing. The digital world brings so many wonderful things and so many challenging things. So for example, a recent one that I have listened to now a number of times, the actress Ellen Bernstein guest hosted the podcast Death, Sex, and Money, and her guest was Gloria Steinem. Of course, a big hero of mine, and that conversation was so fascinating. And another one that I can think of, there's a new podcast by a woman musician named Helga, and the podcast is called Helga. I don't know that much about her, but I listened to her interview with Solange, and it's terrific. It is so interesting, and I coincidentally, while painting the mural behind us with Hamilton students, I let them be the DJs.
I noticed.
Because I wanted to hear what they were listening to. It was interesting, and I love finding out what other folks are listening to. So one of the albums that we listened to a lot while making this painting was the newest album by Solange. So that, again, a highly recommended interview.
Great.
Another question, this one's for Tracy. Julia Jacquette, Unrequited and Acts of Play features a breadth of mediums and content. Can you comment on the value of displaying a broad range of topics and techniques in a solo exhibition and how that relates to the idea of experimentation?
Well, that's a long question, but it's sort of a question about the curatorial process. I guess when I'm developing exhibitions, I'm looking for a lot of different things and also looking to demystify the process that an artist goes through. So I always try and show elements of process. So we have a number of gouaches. We have the two studies that were the basis for the murals, as well as other gouaches, which are works in themselves. Some resulted in paintings, some may result in paintings or may not. Also an aspect of experimentation, the ceramic works, the tiles that we talked about, as well as the ceramic balls. It's always interesting to see artists who are exploring different areas, and the graphic memoir, which, you know, when I said we should include this in the show, you were like, oh really, that sounds great. But it was, you know, I think it's really interesting to explore the fact that artists are not just thinking in one realm or in one medium. Often I hear artists like you describe yourself as a painter who works in many mediums, or a sculptor who works in many mediums. So I think the approach is as a painter, but I think the results are really manifest in many different ways. And for me, it's really fascinating to get inside the mind of the artist and to kind of see all the different proclivities that they are exploring in their work.
Okay, we have one more question.
Great.
And this is for Julia. It's a popular one. How long does it take to paint something as large as a picture of dazzling competence?
Oh, so that is a question I get asked a lot.
How long does it take to make a painting? And they're specifically asking about a picture of dazzling competence, which is 6 images of salad dressing being poured onto these beautifully prepared salads.
And the maybe somewhat unsatisfying answer is I'm never quite sure, because I usually don't work in consecutive studio days. And I should mention, that's because I'm also an educator, and some of the days of the week I am teaching at FIT. I'm teaching painting or drawing or design, and so I stop and start a lot. But that being said, I made that particular painting during the summer when I was just in my studio in Amsterdam. And I think it took me about 3 weeks to make that painting of 3 weeks of full studio days. So my husband and I work in the same studio. He's a singer-songwriter, and we are like bankers. We go in there maybe 10 in the morning and leave at 6 or a little bit later. So we are adamant about getting our 8 hours a day in the studio. So yeah, about 3 weeks on that. But then you're gonna see other paintings in the show that took months and months and months.
Actress Gold Dress, I saw that
Yes.
evolving in the studio
Yes,
over many months. Yes.
And Actress Gold Dress is probably more well-traveled than many of us in this room. Actress Gold Dress was started in Amsterdam, and then it got shipped, and I worked on it in Italy, where I was at an artist residency in Bogliasco, Italy, and then it got rolled up and came to New York City, where I did a little bit more work on it. So it's been a lot of places, as Playground of My Mind has. Playground of My Mind went to all the aforementioned places, and then even a few countries where it wasn't worked on, but I kept it with me, and I really kind of, in its little portfolio, clutched it next to me when I was traveling to make sure nothing happened to it, because that was many years of work in that little compact portfolio.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for our discussion with Julia Jacquette. Feel free to go to the Welland Museum's website. There's a 360 virtual tour of the entire exhibition, as well as images, and we've had some great press about the show. There's links to all the articles there, as well as all the pages of Playground of My Mind for people who wish to explore that as well. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tracy.